Have you ever found yourself pondering what GDP is and why it's so crucial? Well, let's demystify this economic term. GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total value of all goods and services produced within a country over a specific period. It's like the economic heartbeat of a nation, ticking away with every transaction and trade. Whether it's a cup of coffee bought on a bustling city street, a car assembled in a sprawling factory, or a skyscraper erected in a booming metropolis, each contributes to the GDP. It's a measure that helps us gauge the size and health of a country's economy. A rising GDP indicates a thriving economy, while a falling GDP can signal trouble on the horizon. So whether you're an economist, a business owner, a policymaker, or just a curious individual, understanding GDP is key to comprehending the intricate dynamics of the economy. So in essence, GDP is like a snapshot of a country's economic health. Now that we know what GDP is, let's delve into its components. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is like a grand pie, and it's made up of 4 key ingredients or components. These are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Let's start with the first slice of the pie: consumption. This is the largest component of GDP, accounting for more than half of the total in most countries. It includes all the goods and services bought by households, from your morning coffee to your new car, to the services of your hairdresser. Every time you open your wallet, you're contributing to the consumption component of GDP. Next up is investment. Now, this isn't about stocks and bonds. Investment in GDP terms refers to businesses spending on capital goods. So when a company buys new machinery, builds a new factory, or invests in research and development, that's all part of the investment component. It's a key driver of economic growth and technological progress. The third slice of our GDP pie is government spending. This includes all the money that the government spends on its various programs and services, from infrastructure and education to defense and healthcare. Government spending is a crucial part of GDP because it provides public goods and services that the private sector may not provide efficiently. Finally, we have net exports, the last ingredient in our GDP pie. This is the difference between what a country sells to the rest of the world, its exports, and what it buys from the rest of the world, its imports. If a country exports more than it imports, it has a positive net export, and this adds to GDP. On the flip side, if a country imports more than it exports, it has a negative net export, which reduces GDP. Each of these components plays a unique role in contributing to the overall GDP. How is GDP calculated, you might ask? Well, there are 2 principal methods for calculating GDP: the income approach and the expenditure approach. Let's break them down. First, let's talk about the income approach. This method sums up all the incomes in the economy. That includes wages paid to workers, rent earned by landowners, interest received by capital owners, and profits made by entrepreneurs. It's a way of seeing the total income generated by the production of goods and services within a country. If you add all these incomes together, you get a measure of the nation's GDP. Now, let's move to the expenditure approach. This method is a bit different. It calculates GDP by adding up all the spending on final goods and services in an economy. This includes consumption by households, investment by businesses, government spending on goods and services, and net exports, which is exports minus imports. It's a way of seeing the total spending that goes into acquiring the goods and services produced within a country. Now, you might be wondering, how can these 2 different methods give us the same GDP? It's because of a fundamental principle of economics. Every transaction has 2 sides. If you buy a loaf of bread, you're spending money, and the bakery is earning income. So, the total spending in the economy should equal the total income. Therefore, whether we calculate GDP by adding up all the incomes or all the spending, we should get the same number. In theory, both methods should give us an identical GDP figure. However, in practice, there might be small differences due to statistical discrepancies. But those are usually minor and don't significantly affect the GDP figure. So, whether we're looking at how much everyone earned or how much everyone spent, we end up with the same GDP. GDP alone doesn't tell the whole story. Enter GDP per capita. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is GDP per capita? It's simply the gross domestic product, or GDP, divided by the total population of a country. This figure gives us a more precise measure of individual wealth and the standard of living within a country. Why is it a better measure than total GDP, you ask? Well, let's think about it. A country might have a high total GDP because it's large and has many people. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the average person is well off. For instance, if a country has a high GDP but a large population, the wealth might be spread thin, resulting in a lower standard of living for the average person. On the other hand, a smaller country with a lower GDP might have a higher GDP per capita if it has a smaller population. This suggests that the average person in that country might be wealthier and have a higher standard of living. For example, let's take a look at Luxembourg and the United States. The United States has a much higher total GDP than Luxembourg because it's a much larger country with a larger population. However, when we look at GDP per capita, Luxembourg comes out on top. This means that on average, each person in Luxembourg is wealthier than each person in the United States. It doesn't mean every single person in Luxembourg is wealthier than every single person in the US, but it gives us a general idea of the average wealth per person in each country. So, while total GDP gives us an understanding of a country's overall economic strength, GDP per capita provides a more nuanced view. It allows us to see how that economic strength translates to the average person's economic well-being. GDP per capita gives us a clearer picture of the economic well-being of the average person in a country. Let's see GDP in action by examining the world's richest countries. As we dive into the data, we find that the top 15 richest countries, ranked by GDP per capita, are a diverse mix. At the top of the list, we find Luxembourg. This small European nation is a powerhouse of finance and banking, with a GDP per capita of over $143,000. Following closely behind is Ireland, with a GDP per capita of approximately $137,000. Ireland's thriving economy is a result of its strong technology sector and favorable tax policies that attract foreign investment. Next up, Singapore, a small city-state that has become a global hub for trade, finance, and logistics. With a GDP per capita of over $133,000, its strategic location and skilled workforce have been key to its prosperity. Qatar, the world's richest country in terms of natural gas and oil reserves, comes in fourth. Its GDP per capita stands at over $114,000. Switzerland, known for its robust manufacturing sector and banking services, rounds out the top 5 with a GDP per capita of nearly $90,000. The remaining 10, including the United Arab Emirates, San Marino, Norway, the United States, Denmark, the Netherlands, Brunei Darussalam, Iceland, Austria, and Saudi Arabia, each have their unique economic strengths. These range from natural resources to manufacturing prowess, strategic positioning, and a well-educated workforce, contributing to their high GDPs. What's clear from this overview is that these countries have diversified economies, attract substantial foreign investment, and prioritize infrastructure development. They've leveraged their unique advantages, whether that be natural resources, strategic positioning, or a skilled workforce, to create thriving, prosperous economies. These countries show how GDP can reflect a nation's economic success. So, we've come a long way from asking, what is GDP? From this journey, we've learned that GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific period of time. We peeled back the layers to understand the components of GDP, including consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. We've also understood how GDP is calculated, with each component playing a crucial role in the final figure. We then moved on to GDP per capita, a measure that gives us a per-person perspective of a country's economic output. In our exploration, we've seen the world's richest countries by GDP, from Luxembourg at the top, all the way to Saudi Arabia. These nations showcase the power of economic diversity, strategic positioning, and skilled workforces in achieving high GDP figures. But let's not forget, GDP is more than just a statistic, more than just a ranking. Remember, GDP is more than just a number, it's a reflection of a country's economic health and the well-being of its people.